The day was ending at the auto plant with the bitter taste of defeat. For 48 hours, the company's engineering elite had taken turns in a futile siege against a silent metal god. The V12 engine, the newest and most expensive prototype the company had ever developed, remained inert in the center of the factory floor, a multi-million-dollar sculpture that refused to be born. The computers had been consulted, the diagnostics rerun, and the conclusion was always the same: an inexplicable silence. The team, exhausted and frustrated, began to pack up their equipment, leaving behind only the cold machine and the weight of a collective failure. Meredith Shaw, the brilliant mind behind the project, watched her team's retreat from inside her glass-walled office. A queen in her castle, she was a woman forged in precision and data, whose success was measured in graphs and efficiency. That engine wasn't just a project, it was an extension of her own reputation. The machine's stubborn silence was a personal insult, an anomaly her impeccable logic could not fathom. Every minute the prototype remained lifeless was a crack in her armor of competence, a reminder that, for the first time in her career, she was completely lost, with no clear path forward. As the white-coated engineers withdrew, a lone figure remained on the nearly empty factory floor. Hank, one of the oldest mechanics at the plant, was finishing cleaning his tools, his movements slow and deliberate. He watched the engine from a distance, not with the arrogance of someone who knows the answer, but with the empathy of an old friend. To him, machines weren't just a collection of parts and circuits. They had a soul, a rhythm, a language of their own that most people had forgotten how to hear, and he felt with a certainty that came from his gut that this engine was in pain. This knowledge didn't come from a university, but from a lifetime with his hands covered in grease. Hank learned the trade from his father in a small workshop in rural Michigan, where diagnoses were made by sound, by smell, by touch. It was an organic wisdom passed down from generation to generation that valued intuition as much as technique. He saw mechanics not as an exact science, but as an art of conversing with metal, of understanding its tensions and its size. This philosophy, however, made him a relic in the digital age, an anachronism in a world that trusted software more than human experience. Alex, a newly graduated intern, was the only one who noticed Hank's silent presence. Intrigued by the way the old mechanic looked at the prototype, he approached, his curiosity overcoming the prejudice he had learned from his superiors. "What are you thinking, Hank?" he asked in a low voice. Hank didn't take his eyes off the engine. "She's not breathing right," he replied, personifying the machine. "Her heart is beating, but the air isn't getting where it needs to go. The problem isn't where they're looking. They only look at the numbers. They're not listening." Hank pointed to a small junction of cables, an area that all the scans had identified as perfectly functional. "The power is getting lost here. It's a leak too small for the sensors to read, but big enough to keep her from waking up." At that exact moment, Meredith, who had come back for her tablet, overheard the conversation. The audacity of this mechanic, using simplistic metaphors to describe her multi-million-dollar project, struck her. As an offense, the suggestion that he, with his archaic wisdom, could see something her team of geniuses had missed was an insult to her intelligence. She approached, the sound of her heels on the concrete a sharp, irritated beat. She stopped beside Hank, her eyes flashing with cold sarcasm. "Fascinating, Hank. A poetic theory," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "And what is the diagnosis from your grease stethoscope? Please, enlighten us. Tell us what our millions of dollars in state-of-the-art diagnostic equipment failed to see." The challenge was thrown down publicly, a trap to humiliate him, to reassert the superiority of science over what she considered to be merely a worker's superstition. The team, which had been leaving, stopped to watch the spectacle. They expected Hank to shrink, to apologize, to back down before Meredith's authority. But he didn't. He met her gaze, his calm eyes meeting her furious ones. There was no fear on his face, only the tranquility of a man who knows his own worth, regardless of what others think. The tension between them was palpable. The elite engineer, with her brain trained in theories, against the shop floor mechanic, with his wisdom forged in his hands. Hank didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He just glanced back at the silent engine, as if the machine were his only witness and ally. Then he turned back to Meredith and said 3 simple words that echoed through the hangar with the weight of a promise. "Give me an hour." It wasn't a request, it was a statement. The bet was on. 1 hour. A lifetime of knowledge against cutting-edge technology, intuition against data. One man and his conviction against an empire of skepticism, and everyone there held their breath, aware that they were about to witness either a crushing humiliation or a miracle. An old-school mechanic versus the latest technology. An impossible bet made in public. Can Hank's intuition overcome Meredith's logic? Subscribe to the channel. Leave a like if you believe in the wisdom that comes from experience, and send a message of support to the courageous Hank. The battle is just beginning. Hank's hour began. The vast, once noisy hangar plunged into an almost sacred silence, broken only by the distant hum of other machines. The engineers, including Meredith and the young Alex, didn't leave. Instead, they formed a semicircle at a respectful distance, a silent, skeptical audience. It wasn't just curiosity, it was a judgment. They were there to witness the fall of the last titan, the failure of archaic knowledge in the face of modern complexity. Under the solitary light of a floodlight, the scene looked like an amphitheater, with Hank in the center of the arena, alone with the metal beast that had defeated them all. He didn't open his toolbox. His first move was to place his open palms on the cold engine block, closing his eyes. The gesture shocked the engineers, who saw it as a meaningless, mystical act. But for Hank, it was a ritual. A vivid memory transported him to the dusty workshop of his childhood, his father's deep voice echoing in his mind. "Before the wrenches and screwdrivers, son, use your hands. Feel the fever, feel the tremor, feel the breath of the metal." That's how he learned. Not to repair, but to heal. To understand that every engine had a story, a pain, a secret. He opened his eyes and returned to the present, to the looks of disdain. He was used to it. Ever since he had come to the big city of Detroit, his wisdom was treated as folklore. Young engineers, armed with their laptops and theories, dismissed his advice with a superior smile. He was good old Hank, a quaint figure, a fossil from a brute force era of mechanics. He didn't feel anger, just a pang of sadness. He knew that the knowledge he carried in his calloused hands, a legacy of generations, was becoming a dead language in a world that only trusted the binary language of computers. As his fingers traced the fuel lines, Hank's mind traveled to the real reason for his persistence, the reason he endured the daily disrespect and the ache in his back at the end of the day. His younger sister, Sarah, the image of her, smiling from her bed, was the fuel that drove him. Her illness was a constant battle, a mountain of medical bills that grew each month. That job, in that factory that treated him like a museum piece, was the only weapon he had to ensure she got the treatment she needed. He wasn't just fixing an engine. He was fighting for her life. This responsibility was the weight of a promise made on his parents' deathbed. "Take care of her, my son. You're all she has." The sentence echoed in his heart in every moment of doubt. Every bolt he tightened, every diagnosis he made, was an act of love and duty. His pride in his craft was immense, but the promise he had made was sacred. He needed this job. He needed to prove his worth, not for his ego, but for the dignity of his trade and the promise of a better future for his sister. The engine wasn't just a challenge, it was the key to his family's survival. Alex, the intern, watched with growing fascination. Unlike his colleagues, his initial skepticism was dissolving, giving way to a genuine respect. He saw Hank's hands move with a certainty and an economy of motion that no textbook or computer simulation could teach. It was an intimate dance between man and machine, a silent conversation in a language he didn't understand but was beginning to recognize as a higher form of knowledge. He realized that college had given him the map, but this man knew the territory with his soul. Meredith, on the other hand, remained with her arms crossed, her features hardened by impatience. To her, this was a waste of time, a piece of theater. Every minute that passed was a confirmation of her belief that intuition was just a fancy name for guesswork. She didn't see the art, only the grease. She didn't see the wisdom, only the obsolescence. Her mind, trained to find answers in equations and data, was incapable of processing a method based on feeling and listening. She just watched the clock, waiting for Hank's hour to be up so she could finally declare the end of this ridiculous spectacle. There was a moment in the middle of that hour when Hank himself felt the weight of doubt. The engine was a complex beast, a labyrinth of technology that seemed impenetrable. The ticking of the clock, the judgmental stares, the image of Sarah in his mind. It all weighed on him. For an instant he wondered if they were right, if his methods, his heritage, his knowledge were in fact obsolete, if he was just a stubborn old man trying to fight the future with tools from the past. The loneliness of that moment, in the center of the arena, was immense, but the doubt lasted only a second. He closed his eyes and heard his father's final lesson. Machines change, Hank. Technology moves forward, but their hearts are always the same. They were made to work. They just want to be free. Find what's holding them back and set them free. The memory rekindled his conviction. He wasn't a mere mechanic. He was a liberator of machines. He wasn't trying to fix an object, but to restore a life. With renewed resolve, he focused again on the task, his gaze sharp, his touch precise, ready to find the small prison that held the heart of that machine captive. With Meredith's reluctant permission, Hank's hour began ticking down on the large digital clock on the wall. He opened his old toolbox, a worn metal object full of history, which contrasted absurdly with the sleek, sterile diagnostic carts of the engineering team. From within, he didn't pull out a scanner or a multimeter, but a modified stethoscope, a tool the younger engineers had only seen in old movies. The act itself was a silent declaration, the beginning of a ritual that belonged to another time, another way of understanding the world. He approached the engine, and to the astonishment of the skeptical audience, began to listen to it. He pressed the metal tip of the stethoscope against different parts of the casing, his eyes closed in deep concentration, like a doctor listening to a patient's heart. "He has to be kidding," whispered one of the engineers to a colleague, stifling a laugh. For them, who trusted in terabytes of data and high-precision sensors, the scene was the height of absurdity. The attempt to listen to the silence of a dead machine was the final proof of the man's utter inadequacy. However, Alex, the intern, watched with a different kind of attention. He noticed that Hank's movements were not random. There was a method, a pattern. The mechanic was following the engine's power lines, tracing the path the energy was supposed to take, from the generator to the injectors. He wasn't just listening to the silence. He was searching for an anomaly within it, a spot where the silence sounded different, more hollow, emptier. Alex realized that Hank was creating a sensory map of the machine, a layer of information that their own sophisticated programs were unable to generate. Time was running out, and the pressure was mounting. Meredith, impatient, glanced at the clock. 20 minutes have passed, Hank," she announced to the whole hangar, her voice sharp. "No mystical epiphanies yet?" The sarcasm was a tool she used to reassert her authority, to remind everyone that this was just an interlude, a piece of theater, before true science took over. Again, Every second of Hank's apparent inaction was, to her, new proof that her decision to allow this was a foolish concession to nostalgia. Hank, however, seemed to be on another plane of existence. He blocked out her voice, the skepticism around him, the countdown on the clock. He was immersed in a tactile and sonic dialogue with the engine. And then he felt it. It was almost nothing. A phantom vibration, a minuscule dissonance in the electrical current passing through one of the main conductors. A hollow spot, a place where the energy seemed to hesitate for a fraction of a second before continuing its path. It was a defect so subtle, so organic, that it was below the detection threshold of any sensor. It was the machine's silent pain. Alex, with his keen newcomer's perception, noticed the subtle shift in his boss's posture. Meredith's sarcasm no longer stemmed from a place of pure confidence, but from a growing anxiety. There was a rigidity in her shoulders, a way she chewed, her lower lip that he had never seen before. He understood that for her, this was no longer just about the engine. If this mechanic with his primitive methods succeeded, her entire methodology, the basis of her authority, would be called into question. Her reputation, built on the infallibility of data, was on the line. Hank opened his eyes. He had found the problem area, but the exact source was still a mystery. The engine was a labyrinth of cutting-edge engineering. He felt the weight of a time, the burden of their judgment. And heavier than anything, the image of his sister Sarah in his mind. For an instant his confidence wavered. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his greasy hand and looked at the arrogant faces around him. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was just a stubborn old man, a dinosaur trying to fight a meteor of technology. It was then that Alex, in an impulsive gesture of empathy, quietly approached and left a bottle of water on a toolbox near Hank. He didn't say a word, just a brief nod. It was the first demonstration of support, the first act of kindness Hank had received since the challenge began. The gesture, small and silent, was like a glass of water in a desert. It reminded him that not everyone there saw him as a fool, that humanity could still exist in the most unexpected places. That small act of solidarity rekindled his determination. He took a sip of water and remembered his father. Stubbornness is a mechanic's most important tool, he used to say. The machines respect you when you refuse to give up on them. With renewed strength, he turned to Alex. Kid, can you pull up the original electrical chassis diagrams on the screen? Not the diagnostic data, the blueprint, the original design. He wanted to see the creator's intention, the soul of the project, not just the symptoms of the disease. Hank compared the pure design on the screen with what he felt with his hands. He traced a line on the monitor with his greasy finger and then touched the corresponding spot on the engine. It was a translation between two worlds, the digital and the analog. And then he found it. The hollow spot he had felt, the place where the energy hesitated, corresponded to a junction that, in the diagrams, was supposed to be sealed and continuous. But his hands and his stethoscope told him that something there was broken, a microfracture, invisible to the naked eye. He didn't shout, "Eureka!" He didn't make a triumphant announcement. He simply took a small screwdriver from his pocket, a specialized tool he had made himself years ago. An absolute calm settled over his face. The chaos of doubt in his mind dissipated, replaced by certainty. The hour was almost up. Meredith and her team watched him, their arrogance now tinged with a nervous curiosity. They didn't know it, but the story's turning point was no longer a seed. It was about to blossom before their disbelieving eyes. With every failed attempt by Hank, Meredith's sarcasm grew sharper. She circled him like a shark, throwing out comments about the futility of faith versus science, always with a superior smile for her team. The pressure in the hangar was almost unbearable. The other employees, drawn by the drama, made silent bets on how long he would last. Hank felt every stare, every whisper, but he focused on the machine's breath, trying to filter out the human noise to hear the truth of the metal, a truth he knew was there, hidden there. Were moments when he almost gave in. The complexity of that engine was unlike anything he had ever faced. With each failure, the image of his sick sister flashed in his mind, the responsibility for her well-being weighing on his shoulders. Meredith's humiliating bet also echoed in his head, not as a prize to be won, but as an affront to his dignity. He would take a deep breath, the smell of oil and metal filling his lungs, and get back to work. The silent love for his sister and the stubbornness in his heart were the only fuel keeping him going. Alex, the intern, felt torn. Everything he had learned in 5 years of engineering school told him this was a useless spectacle. The engine's failure, according to all diagnostics, was a complex software error or a high-precision electronic component malfunction. The data was clear. Yet there was something in Hank's quiet confidence, in the way he moved around the machine, that challenged the logic of his books. He found himself to his own. Surprise, rooting for the old mechanic, not just out of pity, but out of a genuine curiosity to see if there was, in fact, a wisdom his professors had never taught him. The hour was almost up. Meredith looked at the clock on the wall with a poorly disguised smirk, ready to declare the end of this charade and restore order. The other engineers whispered among themselves, their victory over the machine healer seeming certain. The atmosphere in the hangar was heavy, a mixture of contempt and the anticipation of a public humiliation. Alex felt a knot in his stomach. He realized he wasn't just watching a repair attempt, he was witnessing a conflict of philosophies, a duel between the brain and the soul of engineering. Hank ignored the countdown and the hostile audience. He focused on a small crevice on the side of the engine, a hard-to-reach area the team had barely inspected physically, relying on the sensors. With surgical precision, he inserted one of his custom tools and, with a soft click, loosened something. It wasn't a large part or an electronic component. It was a single tiny bolt, almost insignificant amidst the mountain of metal. He removed it carefully, as if extracting a bullet from a wounded patient's body. He placed the small bolt in the palm of his calloused hand and showed it to Alex, who had moved closer. "Look closely," he said in a low voice. At first glance, the bolt looked perfect, but under the hangar light, Alex saw it. A micro fissure, an almost invisible flaw in the metal's thread. "It's off by a millimeter," Hank explained. "Not enough to break, but enough to create a vibration the sensors can't read. They interpret it as a ghost error all along the ignition line." The explanation was devastatingly and brilliantly simple. The multi-million-dollar failure wasn't a complex bug in the software. It was a 10-cent bolt with a manufacturing defect so minuscule it was beyond the reach of technology, but not the touch of a man who knew the language of vibrations. The problem wasn't in the engine's electronic brain, but in its skeleton. It was an illness that could only be diagnosed by hand, not by graphs. The engineers weren't wrong in their data. They were looking in the wrong place. Hank reached into the pocket of his overalls and pulled out an identical but new bolt. With the same calm, he put it in place, tightening it with the exact force, a torque he measured not with a device, but with the sensitivity of his fingers. The entire repair, the solution to a problem that had paralyzed the factory for days, took less than a minute. The elegance and simplicity of the act made the engineers' weeks of complex and frustrated analysis seem almost comical. They had been hunting for a monster, and the problem was just a pebble in the shoe. With the new bolt in place, Hank stepped back. He wiped his hands on a rag, looked directly at Meredith, and with a simple nod said, "You can start it." He stepped away, his work done, the bet about to be settled. A deep, heavy silence fell over the hangar. Meredith, her face a mask of disbelief, walked slowly to the main control panel. All eyes, once full of scorn, were now fixed on her hand as her finger approached the ignition button. It was the moment of truth. She pressed the button. For a second, nothing. One of the engineers let out a relieved laugh. But then a low, smooth hum began, a sound no one there had heard before. It was the sound of the electrical system, coming to life, without errors, without alerts. The hum grew into a deep, steady roar, the powerful and perfectly tuned melody of a V12 engine running at its peak. The error lights on the panel went out one by one, replaced by a row of green lights. The machine was alive. The sound of the engine, clean and flawless, filled the space, silencing all skepticism. The engineers were dumbfounded. Their faces went from shock to embarrassment, and finally to a reluctant but undeniable respect. They looked from the perfectly running engine to the quiet mechanic standing with his arms crossed, and they understood that they had witnessed something that would change how they saw their own work forever. The wisdom they had so despised had just triumphed spectacularly. Meredith stared at the control panel, the green indicators reflecting in her eyes. Her arrogance had crumbled, replaced by a mute astonishment. The complex problem her brilliant mind couldn't solve had been fixed by a man with a screwdriver and a lifetime of experience. She, the queen of data and logic, had been bested by intuition. She wasn't just wrong. Her entire work philosophy had been challenged by a bolt and by a stubborn mechanic who refused to believe that technology was the only truth. In the stunned silence, broken only by the purr of the engine, a single sound stood out. It was Alex, clapping. At first, hesitant, then firm and loud. He wasn't just applauding the repair, he was applauding the man. He was celebrating the victory of passion over arrogance, of experience over theory, of humility over pride. In that moment, under the gazes of his superiors, Alex decided what kind of engineer he wanted to be. He didn't just want to build machines, he wanted to learn to listen to them. The tension in the hangar dissipated, replaced by an atmosphere of admiration. The humiliation Meredith had planned for Hank had backfired on her. Her sarcastic challenge, her impossible bet, now hung in the air as a reminder of her own blindness. She approached Hank, and for the first time she didn't see him as a subordinate, but as a master. She extended her hand, not as a boss, but as an equal. I was wrong, she said, her voice low but clear. You're a genius. The handshake sealed the end of the battle and the beginning of a new era of respect at the factory. Pride was defeated by humility, and a new connection was born from respect. Hank revealed the true strength behind his hands. Subscribe to the channel to see what blossoms from this seed, and comment, have you ever been surprised by the life story of someone you had misjudged? The perfect purr of the V12 engine was the new sound of the factory. It became a background melody that meant different things to different people. For the shareholders, it was the sound of millions of dollars being saved. For the engineers, it was a hymn to humility, a constant reminder of their own fallibility. For Meredith, it was the sound of her pride being broken. And for Hank, it was simply the sound of a job well done, the voice of a machine that could finally breathe freely. His victory was not loud, but it resonated in every corner of that immense hangar. The engineers who once looked at him with contempt now approached him with a hesitant reverence. One by one, they came with questions, no longer to test him, but to learn. They wanted to understand the logic behind the intuition, the science behind the sensitivity, the arrogance on their faces was replaced by a genuine curiosity. They looked at Hank's greasy hands, no longer as a sign of an inferior job, but as the instruments of a master, of a kind of genius their universities had never introduced them to. Hank answered each question with a simplicity that disarmed them. He didn't use complex technical terms, nor did he boast about his discovery. He explained about metal fatigue, about how each machine has a stress point, as if he were talking about a living being. He didn't place himself above them. He treated them as colleagues, sharing his knowledge as his father had shared with him years before. His humility in victory was even more impactful than the victory itself, a silent lesson that none of them would forget. It was Alex, the intern, who formalized the change. He approached Hank, his notebook in hand, his eyes shining with admiration. "Hank," he said, his voice full of a newfound respect, "would you be willing to teach me? What you know, it's not in the books." The request was a milestone, the representative of the new generation, the future of engineering, asking to be an apprentice to the man they considered a relic of the past. Hank smiled and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. Wisdom, he knew, only stays alive when it's passed on. Meredith watched everything from her glass office, feeling like a foreigner in her own kingdom. The hierarchy she so cherished had been inverted. The center of knowledge in the hangar was no longer her meeting room, but the factory floor around Hank. She retreated to the privacy of her office, the public handshake now seeming insufficient. She needed to process the magnitude of her defeat, the fall of her perfectly logical and predictable world. She had been bested, and she needed to understand how and why. At her desk, the words of her cruel bet echoed in her mind. "If you fix it, I'll marry you." The sentence, spoken with such scorn, now burned her with the fire of shame. It was meant to be a joke, a way to seal his humiliation. But he had achieved the impossible, and now the joke was on her. She felt a deep loathing for her own arrogance, for the ease with which she had used prejudice to try to diminish a man whose knowledge proved far superior to hers at a crucial moment. Later that day, she summoned him to her office. The dynamic was different. When Hank entered, his overalls still stained, she asked him to sit. The team outside watched through the glass walls, curious and apprehensive. The Queen was about to have an audience with the man who had dethroned her. There was no more sarcasm on Meredith's face, only a tired seriousness and a vulnerability no one had ever seen in her. The power in the room had rebalanced in a way she was still learning to navigate. "I wasn't just wrong, Hank," she began, her voice low and clear. "I was arrogant, I was prejudiced, and I was cruel to you." The confession was direct, without excuses. "Your success has forced me to question everything, not just this project, but the way I lead, the way I see knowledge." It was a moment of profound honesty. "I built my career on the certainty of data, and you showed me there are truths the numbers can't tell. I need to understand that." The question that followed was not from a boss, but from a student. "I need to know, not what you did, but how you knew. What sign did the engine give you that none of our sensors could pick up?" She was no longer challenging his methods. She was begging to learn them. The most brilliant engineer in the country was asking for a lesson from the mechanic she had humiliated, admitting there was a form of intelligence her academic world had never taught her and that she desperately needed to comprehend. Hank, seeing the sincerity in her eyes, decided to share not just his technique, but his motivation. He spoke briefly of his father, of the workshop, but then, for the first time, he spoke of Sarah. He told her about her illness, about the bills, about the responsibility he carried. "My concentration doesn't come from nowhere, Mom," he said. "It comes from necessity. Every hour of work, every part I fix, is to ensure my sister has what she needs. I wasn't just trying to fix a machine, I was fighting for her future." The revelation of his personal struggle broke down Meredith's last barrier. His story humanized him in a way that filled her with an even deeper admiration. She no longer saw just a genius mechanic. She saw a man of extraordinary character, carrying an immense burden with a quiet grace and dignity. A new and unexpected emotion began to form inside her, a powerful empathy that completely transcended their professional roles. She finally saw the heart behind those calloused hands. The meeting ended with a new understanding between them. The professional hierarchy still existed, but it was now tempered with a deep, personal respect. When Hank left her office, Meredith looked out at the factory floor, no longer as a queen surveying her domain, but as someone who had just discovered a new and much more complex world within it. The seed of a very different kind of partnership, based not on power, but on mutual admiration, had been planted, promising to blossom in ways neither of them could predict. The news of Meredith's intervention in Sarah's hospitalization spread through the factory like a silent fire. The power dynamic, which had already been shaken, now pulverized. Hank returned to work days later, no longer as the underestimated mechanic, but as a man who held the personal respect and protection of the chief engineer. The looks of disdain had vanished, replaced by a cautious curiosity. He and Meredith had become the center of a new kind of factory folklore, an unlikely alliance that no one understood, but that everyone was forced to respect. Their work sessions became even more intense and productive. The long nights in the hangar, once marked by a professional tension, were now filled with an easy complicity. The synergy between them was almost magical. She would draw a complex theory in the air with holograms. He would translate it into the language of metal, pointing out flaws the software didn't see. Together, they were an unstoppable creative force, the personification of the perfect union between mind and hands. The engineering team, once resistant, began to see the undeniable results and to accept that this was the new, more efficient way to work. Alex, the intern, became the main disciple of this new philosophy. He spent extra hours in the hangar, not to impress Meredith, but to learn from Hank. He absorbed the old mechanic's stories, the lessons about the personality of each type of steel, the importance of feeling the machine. And then he would translate that wisdom into the language of his younger colleagues, acting as a bridge between the two worlds. Slowly, the culture of the department began to change. Arrogance gave way to collaboration, and the absolute certainty of data was tempered by the humility of practical experience. Meredith was also transforming. The tough, inflexible leader was giving way to a more open and human mentor. She began to encourage her team to spend more time on the factory floor, to get their hands dirty, as Hank would say. She realized that true innovation wasn't just born in meeting rooms, but in the creative friction between theoretical and practical knowledge. Her leadership, once based on fear and intellectual intimidation, was now based on respect and inspiration. She was becoming the kind of leader she herself had never had. Outside the factory, their bond deepened into more personal and complex territory. Hank spent all his free hours at the hospital with Sarah, and to the surprise of the nurses, the powerful chief engineer, Meredith Shaw, became a regular visitor. She would arrive with books and fruit, using the excuse that she was following up on the recovery of a valuable employee's sister, but the genuine concern in her eyes told a different story. The hallway of that hospital became the neutral ground, where they were not boss and employee, but just two people sharing anxiety and hope. Sarah, though weak, had a sharp perception. She watched the way Meredith looked at her brother, the softness in her voice when she spoke to him. She saw the admiration in Hank's eyes when he talked about Meredith's work. She saw a connection that went far beyond gratitude. One day, when they were alone, Sarah took her brother's hand. "She doesn't look at you like a boss, Hank," she said, her voice a whisper. "She looks at you like someone who has finally truly seen you. Don't be afraid to be happy. You deserve it." Her words were the permission Hank's heart needed. Sarah's discharge from the hospital was a day of celebration. Meredith insisted on using the company driver to take them home, ensuring they had every comfort. As she said goodbye to them at the door of Hank's simple house, there was a moment of awkward silence. His gratitude was so immense that words seemed insufficient. "I can never repay you for this," he said, his voice choked. Meredith just smiled. "There's nothing to repay, Hank. Friends take care of each other." The word friends hung in the air, officially redefining their relationship and opening the door for something more. In the following weeks, their friendship blossomed. They started having dinner together after work, in simple diners, far from Meredith's social circles. They talked about everything except engines. They spoke of childhood dreams, of secret fears, of the scars that life had left on them. He discovered in her a vulnerable and lonely woman behind the iron facade, and she discovered in him a man of deep kindness and wisdom hidden under layers of grease and silence. They were falling in love, and they both knew it. The romantic tension that grew between them became almost unbearable. At work, they maintained professionalism, but the exchanged glances, the discreet smiles, the way they gravitated towards each other did not go unnoticed. Alex and the closer engineers pretended not to see, but the silent cheering for the couple was unanimous. They represented something new, a paradigm shift not only in engineering, but also in human relations within that hierarchical and impersonal factory. The emotional climax happened one night at work, in the silence of the empty hangar. They had just finalized the design of a new component, a triumph of their collaboration. The euphoria of success left the air charged with a different kind of electricity. They were alone, surrounded by sleeping machines, the only sound being that of their own breathing. The line they had carefully drawn between the professional and the personal was about to be erased forever. It was Meredith who took the first step, true to her direct nature, but now with a newfound vulnerability. She turned to him, her eyes shining under the floodlights. "Hank," she began, her voice little more than a whisper, "what happened with your sister? I didn't do that just because I'm your boss." She took a deep breath, gathering all her courage. "I did it because I care about you, much more than would be professionally acceptable, much more than I should." His confession left her breathless, though her heart had been expecting it. She approached him, the sound of her heels echoing in the silence. "I know," he replied, his voice hoarse, "because I feel the same way about you, Meredith, since the day you gave me that bottle of water." He admitted that the admiration he felt for her, the brilliant engineer, had transformed into something much deeper, a feeling he had tried to ignore but had become impossible to contain. The truth finally spoken filled the space between them. They acknowledged the abyss that separated them. She was the millionaire boss. He, the mechanic from a humble background. Their world, with its rules and prejudices, would never approve of such a union. "This is going to be complicated," she said, more as a statement of fact than as an obstacle. He took her hand, his calloused one enveloping hers, delicate. "I've spent my whole life facing challenges that seemed impossible," he said. "This will just be one more, but for the first time, I don't want to face it alone." In that moment, they made a choice, the choice to try. They left the factory that night, no longer as boss and employee, but as two people who had decided to bet on an unlikely feeling. There was no passionate kiss, no dramatic promise. There was only the calm certainty that they had found in each other something rare and precious, a mutual respect so deep it had transformed into love. Their journey, which had begun with an arrogant challenge and a humble response, now entered its most uncertain and exciting chapter. The news of their relationship wasn't announced, but perceived. It began with small gestures, the shared lunches in the factory cafeteria instead of the executive dining room, the rides he, proud, would refuse, and she, stubborn, would insist on giving. The engineering team, led by Alex, became the silent guardian of the secret, protecting the couple from curious gazes and the gossip that was starting to brew. They had become the factory's unofficial love story, a symbol that barriers could, in fact, be broken. Hank's influence continued to grow. Meredith convinced him to give small practical classes to the interns, sharing his knowledge. At first he hesitated, uncomfortable in the role of a teacher, but upon seeing the curious and admiring eyes of the young people, he discovered a new pleasure in teaching, in ensuring that the wisdom of his hands would not die with him. He was training a new generation of engineers, one that understood that an engine has as much poetry as it does physics. Meredith, in turn, began to frequent Hank's simple house on the weekends. To Sarah's surprise, the powerful executive would sit in the modest kitchen, helping to peel vegetables, laughing at stories from the neighborhood. She was shedding her armor, learning to value simplicity, human warmth, things her life of luxury rarely offered. In that small house, she was not the boss. She was just Meredith, and she felt more at home than in her own mansion. Their relationship deepened far from the spotlight, built on moments of genuine connection. He would take her to classic car shows, showing her the beauty of vintage engines. She would take him to classical music concerts, explaining the mathematics behind the harmony of the symphonies. They were learning each other's language, discovering that despite their opposite backgrounds, their hearts spoke the same dialect, a dialect of passion for what they did, of resilience in the face of hardship, and of a deep respect for each other's journey. Of course, the journey was not without obstacles. Rumors about the director's affair with the worker reached the company's top management. Meredith was called into a closed-door meeting with the board. They expressed their concern for the company's image, for the breach of protocol, for the inappropriateness of the relationship. They subtly threatened her position, suggesting she was letting her personal life interfere with her professional judgment. It was class prejudice, dressed up in corporate jargon. Meredith listened to them with a calmness she had learned from Hank. When they finished, she was succinct. Hank's work and our collaboration have brought more innovation and profit to this company in the last few months than in the last 5 years. My results speak for themselves. My personal life, as long as it breaks no laws, is not up for discussion. Her firmness, backed by unquestionable numbers, silenced the board. She hadn't just defended her relationship, she had defended her right to love whom she chose, proving that her strength was not just in her brain, but also in her heart. This silent victory solidified their commitment. They knew there would always be judgments, that the outside world might never fully understand them, but they also knew that what they had built together was too strong to be shaken by malicious whispers. Their partnership, born of professional necessity, had transformed into a deep friendship, and that friendship in turn had blossomed into a mature and resilient love, a love that needed no one's approval to be true. A year later, the factory was the stage for the biggest event in its history, the launch of the Soul Engine, the first product born from the revolutionary collaboration between Meredith and Hank. The hangar, once a place of tension, was transformed, full of journalists, investors, and the most important names in the automotive industry. The success of the new engine was already a fact. Tests had exceeded all expectations. Meredith took the stage, not with her former arrogance, but with the calm of a visionary leader ready to present the company's future. She began her speech, but she didn't talk about numbers or market projections. She told a story. The story of a silent prototype, a team of frustrated geniuses, and a humble mechanic who believed that machines had a heart. In front of an audience of executives and engineers, she publicly credited Hank with the inspiration behind the company's new philosophy. Technology gave us a powerful brain, she said, but Hank reminded us that every great creation needs, above all, a soul. Then she did something that shocked everyone. And now, I'd like to call to the stage the heart and soul of our new engineering, my partner Hank. Hank, sitting in the front row with Sarah, was taken by surprise. He hesitated, uncomfortable with the spotlight, but an applause, started by Alex and followed by the entire team, pushed him forward. He walked onto the stage, his clean but still work overalls, a symbol of his identity, next to the woman in the elegant suit. They were the perfect image of their two worlds, finally united. On stage, in front of everyone, Meredith took his hand. "Hank taught me that the strongest partnership is the one that unites mind and hands," she told the audience. "He has become my partner in everything in life." Then she turned to him, her voice clear and strong, breaking the final convention. "And so today, I want to ask if you will be my partner forever. Hank, will you marry me?" The silence in the auditorium was absolute. The marriage proposal, from her, the powerful boss, to him, the mechanic, was the final and most courageous act of her transformation. Hank looked into her eyes, then at his sister in the audience, who was crying with joy, and at his team, who were smiling with complicity. His answer was not just for Meredith, but for everyone who had ever doubted him. He took the microphone, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes," he said, 1,000 times. "Yes." The auditorium erupted in a standing ovation, not just for the engagement, but for the beauty of that unlikely love story, which proved that respect and admiration were the strongest bridges that could exist between two people. Their wedding was not a grand social event, but a barbecue in the backyard of Hank's house a few months later. Sarah, now healthy, danced with Alex. The once arrogant engineers chatted animatedly with Hank's old mechanic friends, exchanging knowledge and laughter. They had become a new, large family, a community forged not by blood or status, but by mutual respect and a shared passion for creating things that worked, whether they were engines or relationships. The true celebration was the union of their worlds. The story of Meredith and Hank became a legend in the company and the industry. The lesson was clear. True innovation is born when theory humbly bows to experience, and the mind joins with the hands to create something new. They proved that a person's worth is not in their diplomas, but in their passion, and that the strongest, most unexpected love can blossom on a factory floor, uniting two hearts that the world insisted on keeping apart. The heart of the machine they fixed was, in the end, a reflection of their own hearts, which had finally learned to beat in the same perfect rhythm. A story of respect, overcoming, and a love that broke all barriers. What did you think of Meredith and Hank's ending? Leave your opinion in the comments, like the video if you were moved, and subscribe to receive our new daily stories. Tomorrow's could be about you.